Hi, my name is Chris Cousens and I'm from La Trobe University in Australia. This talk provides an outline of some work that has not yet come to pass. It sits somewhere between a paper and a grant proposal, so I'm very keen for any feedback, suggestions, or advice you might have. The goal is to identify a trend in philosophy of hate speech, one I call hate speech exceptionalism. The basic idea is that philosophers tend to focus on what makes hate speech special or different to ordinary insults. Now, that's all well and good, but it means that we spend less time thinking about the ordinary ways that hate speech harms its victims. So, the project that I'm outlining here seeks to remedy that. In this talk, I will firstly try to define hate speech exceptionalism, then explain why I think it has come to dominate philosophical thinking about hate speech, and also identify the kind of ordinary harms that it sometimes overlooks. I'll provide one central example of the kind of mundane harm of hate speech that I'm talking about, possibly the most mundane thing of all, work. And finally, I'll more tentatively suggest how this ordinary harm might justify restricting hate speech. So, what is hate speech exceptionalism? So philosophers tend to focus on what makes hate speech distinctively harmful. I'll sketch out two examples of this sort of argument to try to make hate speech exceptionalism a little clearer. These are very rough outlines, but I hope get the main idea across. The first is from Waldron, who argues that hate speech undermines the equal civic status of its targets. Citizens have a reasonable expectation to equal civic participation, to be treated equally under the law, to be allowed to live securely. Hate speech undermines those expectations, casting doubt on the assurance that one is seen to be equal, that one will be treated equally, and that one's place in the nation is secure. Hate speech like Muslims go home, said to a Muslim, treats Muslims differently to non-Muslims and suggests that at least some people think that Muslims do not, or should not, have equal status in that society. The security and assurance of equal status of Muslims is then undermined by hate speech. In turn, Waldron says, this undermines dignity, as one's dignity within a society is underpinned by this assurance of equal treatment. Ordinary insults don't do this. You can insult someone without undermining their assurance of equal civic status. So the harm of undermining dignity is then supposed to be unique to hate speech. It's an exceptional harm. Another example comes from McGowan. She argues that hate speech constitutes a kind of oppressive act. Uttering hate speech updates conversational permissibility conditions. When one person says something identity prejudicial, it licenses other people to say similar things. Hate speech targeting gay people, for example, licenses other people to say other disparaging things about gay people. So the utterance changes the rules governing the conversation to make this local specific conversational context unwelcoming. And McGowan argues that there are existing legal precedents where making a specific context, like a workplace or a public space, sufficiently unwelcome to people from a protected group, race, gender, sexuality, that's not allowed. It's restricted or legislated against. This kind of action creates a hostile environment, a technical legal term, but the idea is that if hate speech in public places creates this kind of hostile environment, which is already outlawed when it's created through means other than hate speech, then hate speech should be regulated because creating hostile environments are illegal. But they're only illegal when the hostility is directed towards one of those protected groups. So the harm of constituting a hostile environment is one performed by hate speech and not by ordinary insults, which might create hostility, or a hostile environment or an unwelcome environment, but directed just towards an individual. So again, the harm of hate speech is exceptional. It just belongs to hate speech. So hate speech exceptionalism then is, I think, roughly the commitment to two central claims. That hate speech inflicts exceptional identity prejudicial harm on those it targets, harms that are not shared by ordinary insults. And then secondly, that these are the harms that can inform legislative responses to hate speech. So not only are the harms of hate speech exceptional, but it's those harms and not its other harms that are the ones that might be able to justify us doing something about it. Or at least might be able to justify the law doing something about it. Now, while I agree with the first of these central claims, this paper is challenging the second. I'm not saying that exceptional harms are not inflicted by hate speech, and I'm not trying to claim that hate speech exceptionalists think that hate speech only inflicts exceptional harms, but I do think that these non-exceptional, ordinary, mundane harms might be able to justify its restriction. So, to work out why hate speech exceptionalism is so prevalent, we might compare this way of looking at hate speech to accounts of the experience of actually being targeted by hate speech. Now, these accounts don't tend to focus on the way that hate speech undermines civic status or interacts with legal precedents. They focus on its devastating emotional impact, how much it hurts to be targeted by this kind of speech. But ordinary insults can have devastating emotional impact too. So merely being offensive or upsetting or vile and vicious and abhorrent, that's no grounds on which to restrict hate speech. After all, ordinary insults can also be offensive, upsetting, and vile. And this, I think, is why hate speech exceptionalism is so prevalent in philosophy of hate speech. Because philosophers quite rightly want their work to have real-world impact. And so any argument they give in favour of restricting hate speech will need to be in line with actual legal frameworks. Many countries have clear presumptions, if not outright protections, in favour of free speech. The US Second Amendment is perhaps the most obvious example. First Amendment, the US First Amendment being the most obvious example. If you want your work on hate speech to influence decision-making in the US, it won't be enough to just show how offensive and upsetting and vile the speech is. Because being offensive and upsetting and vile is not enough by itself to restrict speech that's protected by the First Amendment. If we restrict hate speech for being offensive and upsetting and vile, we would also have to restrict personal insults that share those qualities. And as restricting personal insults that fall short of slander is never going to happen, then those qualities can't be enough to get hate speech restricted. It needs to be in some way worse than ordinary insults, distinctive, exceptional. So it makes perfect sense to work from the position of hate speech exceptionalism. But this means that we're looking for the exceptional harms of hate speech and not the ordinary mundane harms, the things it has in common with other offensive speech. And if, as I suggested, this might be the most harmful harm of hate speech, then we're primed to overlook quite a lot in our philosophy of hate speech. Now, this is not to say that philosophers are unaware of or uncaring about the emotional impact of hate speech, just that there are understandable pressures that lead us away from them. I'm going to try to suggest that a closer philosophical look at these mundane harms will not only give us a richer understanding of why hate speech is bad, but potentially overcome these pressures to focus on things that might justify the restriction of hate speech, because these ordinary mundane harms might be able to provide such a justification. So, here I'm setting aside the obvious emotional harms of hate speech. We know how upsetting it is, and we know that this doesn't move lawmakers to restrict it any more than they already have, because they're also aware of these emotional harms. So the example of an ordinary harm overlooked in work on hate speech that I'm going to try to outline today is the claim that hate speech makes additional work for its targets. Now, work might be the most banal harm of hate speech, and compared to the emotional effects, might not seem very morally relevant, and certainly less so than the exceptional harms identified by hate speech exceptionalism. But I think that it might still give us at least some reasons that count in favour of restricting hate speech. So, firstly, how does hate speech make additional work for its targets? I'll briefly outline 3 ways that it does this: by demanding emotional labour, cognitive labour, and a response from its targets. Emotional labour is relatively easy to conceptualise. When someone is targeted by hate speech, they often report feeling scared or threatened or worried or angry or sad or shocked. And these are tiring emotions to be feeling. A lot of complex brain chemical stuff has to go on to let us feel those emotions, and it's wearying. These heightened emotions crowd other mental activity out. When we're very scared or very angry, we can't think about as many other things or think as clearly. A lot of mental processing power gets spent on these emotions, and hate speech is designed to promote fear, vulnerability, and anger, and so on. So there's a lot of effort, a lot of work that goes into emotionally processing hate speech. And secondly, hate speech demands a lot of what I'm calling cognitive labor. Even when we think about it dispassionately and we're not focused on the emotional labor, hate speech forces its targets to think about things in really time-consuming ways. Marie Matsuda makes this point really clearly, and I'll read a quote from her that I think gets this across. She says that she had the experience of arriving in Perth, Australia, to find the entire city plastered with large posters that said, in very graphic bold lettering, Asians out or racial war. It was interesting to me to see my own response. The first response was, of course, a real fear response, the body preparing for a fight. But then some very strange things happened in my mind. I started thinking, they don't mean me, they mean those other Asians, those immigrants, the Hong Kong people. Of course, that's not true. Racists do not make subtle distinctions between native-born Americans and immigrant Asians, or Japanese or Chinese. Racism is racism, and they do mean me. The other thing I found going on in my own psychology was that all my interactions with white people from then on were coloured by the fact that this hate speech existed in the town. I found myself being super polite, using an educated inflection so that people wouldn't confuse me with those other Asians. If people were rude to me, I had to stop and think, now, is this plain old ordinary rudeness or is this racism? A whole layer of junk coloured all my normal interactions with other human beings. So I think it's this layer of junk and wading through it that is the kind of cognitive labour I'm talking about. Matsuda is saying she had to think much more carefully about her interactions with people. She had to second guess their motivations, wonder if they were one of the racists, and she also changed the way she presented herself, having to think about how to emphasise her accent and what inflections she was using in her speech. And she did this just to navigate the context where hate speech was existing. And doing all of that, it takes significant cognitive effort. So that's the second of these ways that hate speech makes its targets work more, performing this kind of cognitive labour. And finally, hate speech also demands a response. Maybe the most positive instantiation of this is counterspeech. So when someone hears hate speech, one might feel compelled to respond, to challenge the hate speaker, maybe saying that they're wrong, trying to explain why, or just to show them that their hate speech is not accepted by everyone. And it's not only the targets of hate speech who can offer counterspeech, but they often bear a disproportionate burden to do so. But not all responses to hate speech are counterspeech. One might leave the situation or try to block the hate speaker out of the conversation. Or one might try to say something, as Matsuda did, to signal that you're not part of the problem, that you're one of the good ones. Responding to any speech takes time and effort, albeit not that much. But trying to respond to hate speech, given the high stakes surrounding it and the additional emotional and cognitive labour that you're also undertaking, in those circumstances, composing and delivering a contextually appropriate response is very difficult, and again, takes more time and effort. So all told, hate speech demands a lot of work from its targets, but ordinary insults do this as well. When someone calls me lazy, I might be sad or upset or angry. Dealing with those emotions is the same kind of emotional labour demanded by hate speech. Maybe set aside fear, but ordinary insults could potentially also provoke a fear response. Being called lazy might also make me second guess my social interactions and change the way I present myself, trying to signal that I am, in fact, extremely productive. And it might demand a response, my saying something to reject the premise or promise to work harder, all the while trying to process the emotional and cognitive demands of the insult. So the additional work demanded by hate speech is far from exceptional. It's mundane and ordinary, a result of both hate speech and everyday insults. And if we're not going to outlaw saying lazy, then how could we use this additional work, the labour that is demanded by hate speech, how could we use that to justify its restriction? I think that the answer lies not in the nature of the harm itself, but in the way that it's distributed. Who actually has to perform the additional labour demanded by hate speech? The answer is, most simply, those it targets, members of already marginalised and vulnerable groups. Hate speech that is racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, or ableist, it asks people already facing additional barriers to enjoying the bounties of modern society to do even more work just to get by. It makes it harder, demanding more effort, for people to simply exist in a world filled with hate speech that targets them than it does for those that the hate speech doesn't target. So the harm of this additional work, then, is also a harm of unequally distributed labour. This is why on this axis, I think that hate speech might be regulable, while ordinary insults like lazy would not be. Hate speech makes some people do more work than others, and this isn't random. It's patterned, affecting the targets of hate speech, typically people already facing institutional and structural challenges and prejudice. Utterances of lazy do not do that. The additional work that they demand is demanded only of the individual target. Although, if there was a racist practice of using lazy to target, for example, people of colour, then this would fit the same kind of pattern and justification for regulation. But the key thing here is that the extra work that's demanded by hate speech patterns with other structures of subordination. So we could potentially compare this unequal distribution of labour to a sexist workplace that asks women to work 15 minutes longer to receive the same pay as their male co-workers, or a workplace that hires women if they have master's degrees, but men if they have bachelor's degrees, or a racist housing practice that pushes people of colour further away from places of high employment or well-paying jobs, forcing them to spend more time and effort commuting than their white colleagues. Asking members of marginalised and vulnerable groups to do more work in this way is something that we would rightly seek to change. And in some cases, it's already regulable, especially when it comes to the workplace. Demanding that women work more than men to receive the same pay is, at least on the surface, illegal in some or many countries. But demanding that an individual employee works longer to receive the same pay, or paying people at the same level different wages, is allowed, as long as it's not patterned in a discriminatory way. So the harm in these cases isn't that some people have to do more work than others, it's when that work is patterned in a way that entrenches and reflects existing social disadvantages. The same kind of reasoning, I think, could offer a new way to argue for the restriction of hate speech. Just as we outlaw certain employment practices only when their unequal demands are disproportionately placed on vulnerable groups, we could outlaw certain speech practices that also place unequal labour demands on marginalised groups. Hate speech does this, so plausibly could be restricted, while ordinary insults remain unrestricted, despite also making more work for their targets. The moral issue and the rationale behind the restriction is not in the nature of the harm itself, but in the way that it is distributed. It is about who is asked to do the extra work. And we could make a similar kind of argument for the emotional impact, the emotional harms of hate speech. Even though ordinary insults might be able to provoke similar emotional harms, they don't do so in a way that fits the same pattern. So when people say that hate speech is the price we have to pay for free speech, they're not thinking that they will be the ones who have to pay it or do the extra work to deal with it. That's because the cost of hate speech is borne by people already paying a price simply for being who they are.